Hey guys, it's Megan. I'm here in the art library and I thought I would do a little roundup of the books that I read in June since it is the end of the month. So normally I do this as a write-up on my blog, but I have been doing a lot of writing lately. I've been working on 2 different books, which if you're curious about those, make sure you're on my mailing list. But I've been working on 2 different books, doing a lot of writing, and so I thought I would just talk it out and share the books that I read this month because I actually read 7 books this month. So there's a lot going on here. Buckle in. The first book I read, yes, this in fact is a library book. I do sometimes check books out of the library. The first book I read is Sounds Wild and Broken. The subtitle, which is really what drew me in, was Sonic Marvels, Evolution's Creativity, and the Crisis of Sensory Extinction. And anytime you get the word sensory in the title, I am usually game, and then sensory paired with creativity, and I was like, yes, I'm in. It's by David George Haskell. Absolutely loved this book. It was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize. Totally understandable, not surprising at all. It's clearly a pretty thick book, but it's beautiful. It really covers like this whole range of the way that sound impacts the world. It's, starts with single-celled organisms. It runs through different animals. It talks about humans. It talks about music. It talks about the relationship between sound and art and musical instruments and just so many things. And it's such a beautifully written exploration. So if you at all have interest in any kind of nature writing, highly recommend this one. Put it on your list. The next one that I read, and part of the reason I had a lot of time to read is obviously I was in Europe this month and there's nothing like long flights and waiting for trains and just general downtime when you are traveling to get some books done. So the next book I read was this book called The Ugly History of Beautiful Things, Essays on Desire and Consumption by Katie Kelleher. So this book I really liked this book. It wasn't quite what I expected. So it was really kind of a very surface level dive of a lot of different topics, but sort of basically like the dirty history of some of the things that we find beautiful as society that Kelleher personally finds beautiful. She looks at things like makeup, she looks at porcelain, she looks at all of these different things, and there were the parts that I thought were really interesting, but a lot of it was like a little bit of like a real quick tour through a lot of things. So more than anything, I would say it made me curious about a few of the things, but definitely an interesting read still. All right, so then next book I read was actually one I picked up in Brussels. It's been on my radar for a while. This is actually the UK cover. The US cover looks different, but since I was in Brussels, happy to pick this up. It's called Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma by Claire Dederer. And it's basically about how we look at the creative output of monstrous people. So she talks about Roman Polanski and, Woody Allen and Pablo Picasso and all of these people, and really looks at like, what does it mean to be a fan in the face of the biographies of people who have been really awful. And I wasn't sure, I kept hearing about this book and I wasn't sure if I wanted to read it because I wasn't sure how I would feel about it. And it was incredible. I read like a third of it on the plane home. I just devoured it. I think it's essential reading for everybody. Anyone who thinks about art, who thinks about creativity, who's a fan of anything. I think it's, she touches on J.K. Rowling. Like, I think it's such an important thing, and her approach to it is so nuanced and not preachy and really invites you to come to your own conclusions. And then the ending, the way she kind of sums up the problem, I won't spoil it for you. I know it's like nonfiction books don't typically get spoiler alerts. I'm not going to spoil it for you because I thought the end, the way she kind of summed it up and brought everything together was just so beautiful. So I highly recommend it. My one tiny complaint, so she goes into a little section kind of talking about what it is about women creatives that we sometimes view as monstrous. And she talks a lot about the challenges of being a woman and a creative with children, which is a completely valid conversation. I think it's really important. I do think she goes a little bit into an idea that myself and my other child-free by choice friends do not love, which is sort of this idea that if you're a woman and you choose not to have kids, it's because you are doing it in service of creating great art or creating something in the world. And I think that's a little bit of a tired trope. If you're a woman and you choose not to have kids, then you're a woman who chooses not to have kids. And it doesn't mean that you have to force yourself or try to set yourself to this standard of like making great work just because you don't have children. You can just choose to not have children. So that's my one tiny little beef here, but it's such a minor footnote. The entire book, Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, so incredible. Absolutely 100% recommend it. Okay. Then this is actually a reread for me. I read this, Etel Adnan's Life as a Weaving, about her experience learning to weave and her experience as an artist taking these weaving classes in the 60s. And I had read this once before, after I first saw her tapestries at the Guggenheim in New York. And then I had been flipping through it before my trip to Paris, and she talked about the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries, which I went and saw and were incredible and beautiful. And so it's obviously like a quick little book, and I decided to reread it. And it's just a nice, really short little meditation about weaving in life and her life as an artist. And that's why I reread it. I really loved it. As you can see, I have a lot of positive things to say about this month's books. All right, next book. Oh wait, this one. So this is another one that's been on my radar for a while. It's called The Whole Picture, The Colonial Story of the Art in Our Museums and Why We Need to Talk About It by Alice Proctor. So it's been on my radar. I happened to come across it at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and I thought, yep, this one's coming home with me too. And it wasn't quite what I expected. I think this is really important reading. I think anything that criticizes museums is really important reading, because even though I deeply love museums, I also understand that museums are very problematic institutions. And so I really think this is like important, meaningful writing in the genre. I wasn't quite expecting it to be so focused on like very specific object tales. I kind of was thinking it was going to be a more broad assessment. And she really hones in on specific objects to tell the stories. So it wasn't quite what I expected, but I still think it was very worthwhile if you have an interest in museums and decolonization. I think it's a worthwhile read for sure. All right, gotta move my stack here. Almost done, guys, 2 more. So then, because I'm now a little bit obsessed with weaving after going and looking at the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries, and I just really, you guys know I'm a textile nerd anyway. I always want to read about textiles. So this is another one that's been on my radar for a while. Women's Work, the First 20,000 Years, Women, Cloth, and Society in Early Times by Elizabeth Weiland Barber. If you like history, if you like textiles, if you like just knowing stuff about the world, definitely worth reading. I kind of plowed through this one too. I thought it was really fascinating, really engaging. I don't think it was dry. Again, I love history. I love reading about textiles. I didn't think it was dry. I thought it was really interesting. The way she, uses the archaeological record, the way she examines things to really sit down and look at the ways that weaving and textiles came through in earlier humans, how it was mostly women's work. She talks about areas and times where it wasn't women's work, but how it was mostly women's work. And why that happened, and how the textiles developed, and how the technologies developed. And I just, it seems like a really foundational book in terms of textile studies. So also on the list of recommending. This is why I read so much this month, guys. Like, stuff was great. All right, and then this last one, I had actually picked up before I went to Europe. Didn't take it with me because honestly, it's not big, but it's a heavy book. So it's called All Things Move, Learning to Look in the Sistine Chapel by Jeannie Marshall. And basically the premise of this, which of course, like, this is why I basically picked it up the minute I saw it in the bookstore. The premise is, what does it mean to look deeply at a work of art, and what does it mean to revisit a work of art more than once? So the author, Jeannie Marshall, is a Canadian who has been living in Rome for like the last 20 years. And she spent a lot of time avoiding the Sistine Chapel, and then all of a sudden ends up going to the Sistine Chapel for reasons she talks about in the book, and then just starts repeatedly going and going. And so she examines a lot of stuff, right? She examines why we look at art, what we feel about art. She also looks at the religious and cultural factors that came to play in the creation of the Sistine Chapel. She looks at the iconography in it. It's a really kind of sweeping book. It's not long. It's got some interesting, it's got pictures in it. So I found it to be a pretty easy read. But, one of the things that I want more of in the world is experiential art writing. Books that are not about the history of art, even though, like, clearly I geek out about history and I geek out about theory, and I think all of those things are important. But I want to read about people's experiences of art. Now, this is partly selfish. I want to write about my experiences of art, but I want to read about people's experiences of art. I want to read experiential art writing. And this to me is like a very welcome addition to that genre. There were parts of it that I was kind of like, okay, I get it. Like, 16th century religious conflict is not everyone's jam. There's a little bit of memoir element in it as well. So there's a lot of things woven through, but I'm always fascinated by anyone's experiential writing about art, and I think this is actually a really good one that really digs into why it is we look at art, why something that was created over 500 years ago is still meaningful, why people still go to view it today. So another one that I really loved and would recommend. So those are my books for June. Like I said, a lot of them, because a lot of them were great, it was a really good reading month for me. If you guys have questions about them, please, leave me a comment, send me a DM. You guys know I love book recommendations. And if you guys are reading anything good, let me know, because I've got plenty of stuff to read for July, but you know me, I'm always on the lookout for new books.